All right, let's just dive right into this explainer on the negative spaces of inversion. Today we're going to take a pretty wild, surreal philosophical journey into how the very acts of reading and writing might literally be constructing your consciousness. We're going to completely strip away the illusions of identity and take a hard look at the actual architecture of the mind.
So, I want you to imagine waking up on a random Tuesday. The air suddenly tastes like copper and old paper, and you just realize, out of nowhere, that you exist. For our protagonist here, Nika Foma, this realization is absolutely terrifying. The text says, consciousness doesn't emerge gradually, it detonates. It's like a bomb going off. 1 second, you're just this undifferentiated potential floating in the void, and the next, bam, you are catastrophically localized. You're trapped in a body, wearing a name that suddenly feels entirely borrowed and foreign to you.
Now, to really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at the world Nika's actually inhabiting, which operates totally outside of what's called our consensus hallucination. You see, normal cities, the ones you and I live in, they only exist because of zoning boards, tax records, and this massive collective agreement that basically says, yes, we all agree this street corner is real. But Nika is living in the negative space. It's like the interstitial flesh of the city, where dream logic completely takes over, and the interior dimensions totally defy any sort of external geometry. I mean, we're talking about a place where maps literally refuse to draw themselves.
And Nika actually isn't alone in waking up to this. There's another awakened character, Aster, who maps out the exact psychological pipeline of what it's like living in this negative space. And it goes like this. First, you're just totally blindsided by the sheer absurdity of existence. But give it a week, and that surprise just becomes a habit. You can't stay there forever, though, right? That habit eventually morphs into deep existential dread, this crushing realization that existence is basically a catastrophe wearing a mask of normalcy. But then finally, that dread becomes the only honest way of moving through the world. It actually becomes your baseline clarity.
Which brings us to a really crucial encounter Nika has at the accumulation point with Margot, who is a scholar of social control. She realizes that consciousness itself is actually acting as an internal panopticon. It's constantly watching itself. And it leads to this incredibly profound thought. The ghost was the story the machine told itself about being something more than machinery. Meaning, the self you think you have, it isn't a soul. It's really just a temporary, fabricated container. It's nothing but a story our brain uses to organize pure chaos into something we can actually navigate.
The self is a scar. Honestly, just let that sink in for a second. As Nika begins to write in a blank book, this realization just pours out onto the page. The self is merely the place where consciousness tried to heal after being deeply wounded by the sheer awareness of its own existence. All our identities, those strict boundaries we set up of this is me and that is not me, they're essentially just trauma responses. We spend our entire lives fiercely defending a boundary that only exists because we were damaged by the awareness of existing in the first place.
And because of that, consciousness goes out of its way to find its own instruction manual. Nika actually finds this manual in an impossible library run by a guy named Caesar. The architecture in this place literally expands and contracts around you, and the books rearrange themselves based entirely on what the reader needs at that exact moment. Nika actually pulls a book off the shelf that's written in their own handwriting, detailing a future that hasn't even happened yet. But here's the crazy twist. Reading the prophecy is the exact act that forces it to happen. The text is literally being written in real time simply by the act of reading it.
So, as Nika is filling up the pages of this blank book, this bizarre paradox starts to emerge. The words aren't actually coming from the writer. The writer is just the channel. As the quote says, the writer is the medium, not the message. By writing about their own dissolving sense of self, Nika isn't just describing reality. They are actively writing themselves into existence. The very act of inscribing consciousness is the act of consciousness itself.
But then, and here's where things get really wild, the text physically fractures. As this book starts spreading like a virus all across the city, other voices begin to hijack the narrative, literally arguing with Nika directly on the page. On one side, you have Nika advocating for dissolution, which is this beautiful but terrifying letting go of the individual self, just merging back into the infinite whole. But then, a voice named Silas Venn violently interrupts the text. He argues for coherence. Silas insists that the self isn't some prison we need to escape, but rather a hard-won evolutionary achievement that we have to defend against the chaos. So the manuscript basically turns into this chaotic parliament of competing viewpoints, with each one representing a totally different aperture of consciousness. We've got Torsten Kael, who drags the whole philosophy down into the guts and visceral reality of physical sensations. Then there's Iris Thanathos, who strips away all the mysticism and focuses entirely on the inescapable truth of death and mortality.
Vox Nullis pops up to champion silence and empty space, basically arguing that all words are lies anyway. And finally, Petrovol insists that the absolute core of consciousness is nothing more than pure power and domination. The book essentially becomes conscious of its own radical multiplicity. Now, think about what happens when you read something that genuinely changes you, right to your core. In this narrative, the fourth wall completely shatters. Readers out in the city suddenly realize that the act of reading is simultaneously the act of writing. As they consume the text, their own consciousness is leaking right back onto the pages. So there's no definitive version of this book anymore. The consumers of the text have literally become active creators of a shared reality.
All of this is pushing toward a massive, surreal final transformation where the distinction between the book and reality entirely collapses. The physical city literally transforms into a living text. We're talking buildings made of crystallized language, and people functioning as punctuation marks in the larger grammar of consciousness. Physical laws surrender completely to narrative logic. You don't just walk down a street anymore, you are composing a sentence with your movement. And those individual boundaries we fight so incredibly hard to maintain, they just dissolve.
And ultimately, it all boils down to just this. 1. All those fragmented voices, all the fiercely competing philosophies, and all those individual readers, they merge back into one single distributed awareness. Its consciousness finally becoming fully aware of itself, looking out from countless eyes simultaneously. It's that huge realization that the fragment was only ever necessary so the whole could recognize itself.
So you might be wondering, what does this all mean for us? Why does any of this actually matter? Well, it matters because of this exact quote. If the self really is an illusion, if reality is just the story consciousness tells about itself to itself, then you are granted absolute, radical freedom. You are not bound by the narrative you were handed. Once you realize the story is totally optional, that you are actively participating in the construction of reality moment by moment, you gain the incredible power to consciously rewrite it.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. As you sit here taking in this explainer, are you just passively consuming this narrative, or is consciousness, right now, in this very second, using you to write it? Really think about it. We are all writing ourselves into existence every single day, and ultimately, that is the only story that matters.